Elizabeth Wettlaufer was born Elizabeth Parker on June 10th, 1967, in the small city of Woodstock, Ontario. Woodstock, often called the Friendly City, was known for its quiet neighborhoods, modest churches, and close-knit families. She grew up in a strict Baptist household, where her father's religious views shaped much of her childhood. From a young age, Elizabeth was described as shy and socially awkward, often struggling to fit in with her peers. While her family presented a picture of traditional values and discipline, she carried an inner restlessness that never seemed to leave her. In her early years, Elizabeth pursued education rooted in religion, studying religious instruction before deciding to switch to nursing. She attended Conestoga College in Kitchener, Ontario, and graduated in 1995 as a registered nurse. At first, her career choice seemed to be a natural fit. Nursing offered her the stability of employment, the respect of the community, and most importantly, direct access to vulnerable patients. To her family and friends, it looked like Elizabeth had chosen a life of service and compassion. But even as her career began, cracks were already showing. She struggled with her mental health for much of her adult life. She was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder, conditions that often left her with intense mood swings and feelings of emptiness. Alongside this, she developed addictions to alcohol and prescription medications, problems that would follow her into her career. At different points, she sought help through rehabilitation programs, but she often returned to the same destructive patterns. Her personal life also mirrored this instability. In 2007, her marriage to her husband, Daniel Wettlaufer, ended in divorce. The separation left her increasingly angry and unsettled. Elizabeth herself later admitted that this period of her life was one of deep frustration, where her personal struggles often spilled into her professional world. From the start of her career, Elizabeth had difficulty holding onto jobs. Early employment at hospitals raised concerns about her behavior. She was once dismissed from a hospital for giving the wrong medication and appearing impaired on duty. Despite these serious issues, she was able to secure new positions. At that time, regulations in employer communication often failed to flag poor performance records to future workplaces. This loophole gave her opportunities to continue nursing without her full history being revealed. In June of 2007, Elizabeth began working at Carison Care, a long-term care home in her hometown of Woodstock. Most of her shifts were overnight, and supervision was minimal and staff numbers were lower. On the surface, she appeared to be another ordinary night nurse, a caregiver who quietly moved from room to room checking on patients. Families who placed their loved ones in her care never suspected that anything was wrong. Yet, behind her reserved demeanor, Elizabeth was already beginning to develop what she would later describe as dark urges. At Carison Care, Elizabeth found herself in an environment where her mistakes were overlooked or treated as common workplace errors. Medication mix-ups, careless decisions, and unusual behavior on shift did not trigger the kind of scrutiny they should have. For nearly a decade, these warning signs were not taken seriously, and the system that should have stopped her failed at almost every turn. Part 1 of Elizabeth Wettlaufer's story is not yet about the crimes that made her infamous, but about the hidden instability and personal struggles that set the stage for what was to come. She was not a nurse who snapped overnight. She was a deeply troubled individual whose personal demons, professional misconduct, and repeated red flags were ignored, leaving her in the very position where she would eventually commit some of Canada's most shocking crimes. By the time Elizabeth Wettlaufer settled into her position at Carison Care in Woodstock, Ontario, she had been nursing for more than a decade. Working the quiet overnight shifts, she had easy access to patients who were elderly, vulnerable, and entirely dependent on their caregivers. It was in this environment, between the late 2000s and early 2010s, that her crimes began. Elizabeth later confessed that she felt an overwhelming urge to kill, a compulsion she described as a release of anger and frustration. Unlike many killers, she did not rely on violence or physical confrontation. Instead, she used her position of trust and her access to powerful medications. She administered deliberate overdoses of insulin, a substance readily available in the care home. Because her victims were elderly and often already suffering from serious medical conditions, their sudden decline rarely raised immediate suspicion. Her first known victim was James Silcox, an 84-year-old veteran of the Second World War. He died in August of 2007 after being injected with an unnecessary and lethal dose of insulin. His passing was recorded as a natural death at the time. Elizabeth later admitted to police that his death was her first deliberate killing, and it marked the beginning of a pattern she would follow for nearly a decade. Over the years, Elizabeth struck again and again. At Carissant Care alone, she targeted multiple residents, most of them elderly men and women who were already frail. Some of her victims died quickly after the injection, while others lingered in pain or confusion before passing. The unpredictability of insulin overdoses meant that not every patient she targeted died. Several survived the attempt, though their health was left shaken. This mixture of fatalities and survivors would later complicate the investigation into her actions. Despite the suspicious number of sudden deaths in the facility, Elizabeth remained employed for years. Staff occasionally questioned her behavior, noting her emotional instability, frequent mistakes, and erratic conduct on the job. Yet, instead of triggering a deeper inquiry, these concerns were often brushed aside. The long-term care system struggled with staffing shortages, high turnover, and limited oversight, conditions that allowed her to keep working even as her actions became more dangerous. By 2014, Elizabeth's employment at Carissant Care ended after repeated issues with her performance and medication errors. She was not reported to the College of Nurses of Ontario for misconduct, and as a result, she was able to continue practicing. She later found work at other facilities, including Meadow Park Nursing Home in London, Ontario, and eventually a position providing home care in the community. Each new role gave her fresh access to vulnerable patients. Her methods remained the same. She injected residents with insulin, sometimes watching them decline over hours or days. Other times, she left the facility before the effects became apparent. Elizabeth often told investigators that she believed she was acting on a compulsion, sometimes framing her actions as mercy killings. Though her victims' families rejected that idea completely, none of the residents had consented to or requested such actions. They had simply been placed in her care with the expectation of safety. During these years, Elizabeth kept her actions mostly to herself, though she occasionally dropped cryptic hints. She sometimes told friends or acquaintances that she had done bad things or that she had a dark secret, but few took her words seriously. It would take years before anyone fully understood the weight of her confessions. By the mid-2010s, Elizabeth had already killed multiple people and harmed several others. Yet the system still had not exposed her crimes. Patients continued to trust her, families continued to believe their loved ones were safe, and the institutions that employed her had no idea they were giving a serial killer unrestricted access to the most vulnerable people in their care. By 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer's life had begun to unravel. After years of working in long-term care facilities and private homes, her erratic behavior, depression, and struggles with substance use had left her increasingly unstable. She was no longer employed in a steady nursing position, and her personal life was marked by isolation. It was during this period of decline that her need to unburden herself finally overcame her desire to keep her crimes hidden. In September of 2016, Elizabeth voluntarily entered a psychiatric hospital in Toronto. During the therapy sessions, she revealed disturbing details about her past actions. She admitted to staff that she had intentionally killed multiple patients while working as a nurse, using insulin injections to end their lives. Unlike many serial offenders who are discovered through evidence and investigation, Elizabeth exposed herself by making these confessions openly and repeatedly. The hospital staff were alarmed by her statements and contacted the police. On September 16, 2016, Elizabeth gave a written confession to Toronto law enforcement officers. In it, she described in detail how she had injected elderly patients over the years, sometimes with the intent to kill, and other times leaving the outcome to chance. This written statement marked the beginning of one of Canada's largest criminal investigations into healthcare-related deaths. Police quickly realized the magnitude of what she was saying. The victims she named had all been elderly residents who had died while under her care in various facilities across Ontario. Many of those deaths had previously been attributed to natural causes, a conclusion that made sense at the time given the advanced age and fragile health of the patients. But now, with Elizabeth's admission, each case had to be carefully re-examined. Following her confession, investigators began working with the Ontario Provincial Police to collect evidence from the care homes where she had worked. Medical records, staff reports, and death certificates were reviewed. Families of the deceased were contacted and informed of the shocking possibility that their loved ones had not died naturally, but had instead been deliberately harmed by a nurse they trusted. This revelation sent waves of grief and outrage through Ontario communities, especially in Woodstock and London, where many of the deaths had occurred. On October 25th, 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer was formally arrested. She was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. These charges covered a period from 2007 through 2016 across multiple care facilities and patient homes. The news made national and international headlines, with many Canadians struggling to comprehend how a licensed nurse had been able to kill repeatedly without being detected for nearly a decade. What stood out most about the case was that Elizabeth had not been caught through forensic evidence, surveillance, or even staff whistleblowing. Instead, she had come forward on her own, unable to carry the weight of her actions any longer. Her willingness to confess set her apart from many serial offenders, though it did not lessen the horror of her crimes. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought both shock and a painful kind of clarity. For years, they had believed their loved ones had passed away naturally, and now they faced the devastating truth that those deaths had been deliberately caused. As the legal process moved forward, the question of how the healthcare system had failed to detect her actions became a matter of national concern. After her arrest in October of 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer was held in custody while investigators built the case against her. The scale of the crimes stunned both the public and the legal system. Never before in Canada had a healthcare worker been charged with such a series of killings across multiple facilities. The Ontario Provincial Police and Crown prosecutors prepared for a complex trial that would involve testimony from medical experts, families, and colleagues. In June of 2017, Elizabeth appeared in a Woodstock courtroom to face the charges. In a surprising move, she chose not to contest the evidence. Instead, she entered a guilty plea to all 8 counts of first-degree murder, as well as to the charges of attempted murder and aggravated assault. By doing so, she avoided a lengthy trial and spared families from the emotional strain of listening to evidence presented in court. During the sentencing hearing, Elizabeth spoke openly about her actions. She admitted to struggling with personal issues for many years, including depression and a deep sense of guilt that eventually led her to confess. While she acknowledged her responsibility, her statements also left many questions unanswered, particularly about why she had been able to continue for nearly a decade without detection. The families of the victims were given the opportunity to read victim impact statements in court. These statements described the heartbreak, confusion, and anger they felt upon learning that their loved ones had been deliberately harmed. For many, The shock was compounded by the fact that they had trusted the healthcare system to provide safety and care. The courtroom was marked by grief, but also by a sense of determination to seek justice for the victims. On June 26, 2017, the judge delivered the sentence. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was given life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. This meant she would not be eligible for release until the year 2042, when she would be in her late 70s. The sentence reflected the severity of her crimes and ensured that she would spend the rest of her life in custody. The guilty plea and sentencing marked the official conclusion of the criminal case, but it did not end the questions surrounding how she had been able to act undetected for so long. The case sparked widespread discussions across Canada about oversight in healthcare, the use of insulin, and the ability of medical institutions to identify unusual patterns in patient deaths. Elizabeth's sentencing also highlighted the uniqueness of her case. Unlike many convicted killers, she had voluntarily confessed, leading directly to her arrest and conviction. Without her decision to come forward, it is possible her crimes might never have been discovered. For many Canadians, this was both chilling and deeply troubling, as it revealed significant weaknesses in the systems meant to protect vulnerable patients. The conclusion of the trial brought some closure to the families, but it also left them grappling with the lasting impact of betrayal and loss. At the same time, attention began to shift toward how the government and healthcare industry would respond to prevent anything similar from happening again. Following Elizabeth Wettlaufer's guilty plea and life sentence in June of 2017, the focus in Canada turned to how such crimes could have gone undetected for nearly a decade. The Ontario government announced a full public inquiry to examine the systemic failures that allowed her to continue harming patients while working at different care facilities. The inquiry, called the Public Inquiry into the Safety and Security of Residents in the Long-Term Care Home System, was led by Justice Eileen Gilles. Hearings began in June of 2018 and continued into the following year. The proceedings included testimony from administrators, co-workers, families, medical experts, and government officials. The goal was to determine how Elizabeth's actions went unnoticed and what could be done to strengthen protections for vulnerable patients. One of the key findings of the inquiry was that warning signs had been missed. Elizabeth had been disciplined or asked to leave several nursing positions, yet her behavior was never thoroughly investigated. In some cases, suspicions were raised about her conduct, but no clear steps were taken to alert regulators or law enforcement. The inquiry concluded that long-term care homes, oversight bodies, and even the healthcare licensing system lacked the tools and communication channels to detect patterns of abuse. In July of 2019, Justice Gilles released the final report. It contained more than 90 recommendations aimed at improving safety in long-term care. These included strengthening whistleblower protections, improving staff training, and enhancing oversight of medication use, particularly insulin. The report also called for better communication between care facilities and regulatory agencies to ensure concerns about staff members would not be ignored or overlooked. The Wettlaufer case had a profound impact on the public trust. Families across Canada began questioning whether their loved ones were truly safe in nursing homes. The healthcare sector responded by reviewing policies, creating new reporting requirements, and emphasizing transparency. While these measures could not undo the tragedy, they were intended to prevent future harm. For the families of the victims, the inquiry was both painful and necessary. Many expressed that the changes, while welcome, could never replace the lives that were lost. The emotional damage of betrayal by a trusted caregiver continued to weigh heavily on them. Elizabeth Wettlaufer remains in prison, serving a life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years. She will likely spend the rest of her life in custody, remembered as one of Canada's worst criminals. Her case continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, oversight, and accountability in systems that care for the most vulnerable members of society. The story of Elizabeth Wettlaufer is not only one of shocking crimes, but also of the lessons that Canada has had to learn. It exposed weaknesses in healthcare oversight, highlighted the need for reform, and left a permanent mark on the country's collective awareness of patient safety. Though justice was delivered in the courtroom, the true legacy of this case lies in the lasting changes it brought to how Canadians protect those who cannot protect themselves. In the far north of Saskatchewan, the town of Buffalo Narrows sits surrounded by dense boreal forests and frozen lakes, a place where life moves slowly and everyone knows their neighbors. In the late 1960s, the population was just over 700, making it a tight-knit community. The Peterson family was well known in town. Thomas Peterson and his wife Bernadette were in their early 30s, raising a family of 7 children. Their modest 2-room home was a hub of daily life, with children playing in the snow outside in winter and helping with household chores during the warmer months. The Pedersons were respected for their faith and their commitment to the community. They were Roman Catholic and participated actively in local events and church services. Life in Buffalo Narrows was shaped by the harsh northern winters, with temperatures regularly dropping well below freezing. Residents relied on one main road that could often be blocked by snow, making the town feel isolated from the rest of Saskatchewan. On the night of January 30th, 1969, the town was blanketed in deep winter darkness. Most families were asleep early, and snow muffled the usual sounds of the small settlement. The Pedersen children had a rare break from their normal routine. 2 of the older girls, Connie and Cynthia, were staying at their grandmother's house for a sleepover. This small detail would later prove critical. Inside the Peterson home, the family's youngest children were tucked into their beds. The house was quiet, lit only by a small kerosene lamp in the kitchen, and the wind whispered outside through the cracks in the windows. In this peaceful setting, the foundations of the family's safe, ordinary life were about to be shattered by events that would shock the entire community. In the dead of night, on January 30th, 1969, 19-year-old Frederick Moses McCallum left his small home in Buffalo Narrows. He had been living on the edge of town, doing day labor and struggling with serious mental health issues that were known to some in the community. That evening, McCallum carried a long-handled fire axe and moved deliberately through the snow-covered streets toward the Peterson house. The night was bitterly cold, with temperatures reaching around 40 degrees below zero, and a strong wind carried the sound of footsteps across the frozen land. Inside the Peterson home, the youngest children were asleep, unaware of the danger approaching. McCallum entered the house and attacked with a chilling precision. Thomas and Bernadette Pedersen were killed, along with a family friend who was staying overnight, Jean-Baptiste Herman, aged 48. In the second bedroom, 5 of the Peterson children were found injured. The small figure of 7-year-old Fred Donald Pedersen would later be discovered alive, having survived despite serious injuries. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived later that morning, they were met with a scene that stunned even seasoned officers. Snow crunched underfoot as they approached the home, and the cold air seemed to amplify the silence of the settlement. It was immediately clear that the attack had been confined to the house. Nothing in the surrounding area had been disturbed. The RCMP set up an immediate perimeter and began gathering information from neighbors and townspeople, while ensuring the surviving child received medical attention. The investigation at that moment was both delicate and urgent. Officers knew that in a town as small as Buffalo Narrows, the killer could not have gone far. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed recent conflicts in the community, and began piecing together the movements of McCallum. Witnesses reported seeing him leave his home that night carrying something long and heavy, moving with a deliberate, almost trance-like focus. As the morning sun struggled to rise over the frozen trees and lakes, the RCMP began planning a manhunt. Roadblocks were set up on the few roads that connected the town to the outside world. Aircraft were readied to survey the surrounding forests, while officers on foot moved through the snow in coordinated search parties. The small northern community of Buffalo Narrows watched with fear and disbelief, realizing that a tragedy of unimaginable proportions had occurred in their midst. This initial discovery and rapid police response set the stage for understanding both the killer and the shocking motives behind the attack. The residents of Buffalo Narrows were left grappling with the horrifying reality that someone from their own town could commit such an act, while the authorities faced the urgent task of preventing further violence. Frederick Moses McCallum was 19 years old at the time of the attack, but his life had already been marked by instability and hardship. He grew up in a fragmented household as one of 9 half-siblings, each with different fathers, and experienced frequent moves between foster homes. By the age of 16, he had already spent time in youth detention for minor offenses. It was during these early years that those around him began to notice serious mental health issues. McCallum reported hearing voices and believed that everyday objects, like radios, were communicating directly with him. After the murders, McCallum did not flee. Instead, he calmly returned to his mother's home, where he made a phone call to the local priest. In that call, he confessed to the attack and provided details only the perpetrator could know. The priest immediately contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who arrived quickly in the small northern town. McCallum was found sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea, appearing unusually calm, given the magnitude of his actions. He reportedly expressed no remorse, and some of his statements indicated a disturbing detachment from reality. The RCMP immediately took him into custody without any resistance. They secured the scene at his residence and began a detailed interview process. Investigators noted that McCallum's mental state was fragile, and he described his actions in ways that reflected disordered thinking. Psychiatric professionals were called in to evaluate him, and it was during this assessment that he was formally diagnosed with schizophrenia. This diagnosis explained his distorted perceptions, hallucinations, and inability to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. Police also reviewed McCallum's past interactions with the justice and welfare systems. Records confirmed that despite repeated signs of mental illness, he had received minimal long-term support. While in foster care, he had experienced inconsistent supervision, which may have contributed to the escalation of his condition. Officers considered these factors while preparing the case, knowing that his mental state would play a central role in the legal proceedings to follow. The residents of Buffalo Narrows were both relieved and unsettled by the quick arrest. While the immediate threat had ended, the town now faced the challenge of understanding how such a tragedy could occur in their close-knit community. Families were left grappling with grief, and local authorities began planning counseling and support for survivors. The arrest marked the end of the immediate search, but it also signaled the beginning of a complex legal and psychiatric examination that would dominate headlines in Saskatchewan for months to come. McCallum's behavior after the arrest raised further questions about his awareness of reality. He described feeling as if he were in a trance during the attack, stating that he looked at himself in the mirror and questioned if it was really him committing the acts. These chilling reflections underscored the challenges faced by the justice system in determining culpability when mental illness was a key factor. The arrest and subsequent psychiatric evaluation would form the foundation for a case that captured national attention. Experts debated whether McCallum could be held responsible for his actions, and the town of Buffalo Narrows braced for the trial that would follow, a trial that promised to test the limits of both the law and public understanding of mental illness in criminal cases. Frederick McCallum's trial began in the fall of 1969 and quickly became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in northern Saskatchewan. The prosecution focused on the deaths of Thomas Pedersen and Jean-Baptiste Herman, although all 7 victims were discussed in court. From the beginning, the defense argued that McCallum was suffering from schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder that left him unable to understand the consequences of his actions. Psychiatric experts explained in detail how he experienced hallucinations, disordered thinking, and a profound disconnection from reality, which directly influenced the tragic events of January the 30th. The jury, composed entirely of men from outside the local Indigenous community, faced the difficult task of balancing the severity of the crimes with the evidence of McCallum's mental illness. During the proceedings, the defense presented accounts of his unstable upbringing, including years spent in foster care, early brushes with the law, and repeated signs of mental health struggles. Witnesses described his erratic behavior in the months leading up to the attack, highlighting how he had isolated himself and displayed unusual preoccupations with their voices and visions. After deliberating for 4.5 hours, the jury delivered a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. In Canada, at the time, this legal designation meant that while McCallum had committed the acts, he could not be held criminally responsible due to his inability to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime. The verdict was met with shock and confusion from the surviving family members and the wider community. Many struggled to reconcile the fact that the man who had destroyed so many lives would not spend time in prison, but instead be placed in a psychiatric institution. Following the verdict, McCallum was sent to a secure psychiatric facility for treatment. Over the following years, he would experience transfers between institutions, including brief stays in maximum security facilities, but his diagnosis of schizophrenia remained the central factor guiding his care. Meanwhile, the surviving Peterson children faced ongoing challenges. The two sisters, Connie and Cynthia, were left without their parents and younger siblings, while Fred, who had survived the attack, had to cope with long-term injuries and trauma. The community of Buffalo Narrows rallied to support the survivors, but the psychological scars remained, shaping the lives of the family and neighbors for decades. The case also sparked broader discussions about mental health, the justice system, and how society treats individuals with severe psychiatric disorders. Many observers argued that McCallum's upbringing and lack of early intervention contributed to the tragic outcome. Others focused on the need for better support systems in remote communities, where access to mental health care was limited. The trial highlighted gaps in the legal system when dealing with defendants whose crimes were intertwined with profound mental illness. Decades later, the Buffalo Narrows murders continue to be remembered as a defining event in the town's history. The case remains a cautionary example of how untreated mental illness, combined with social and institutional failures, can result in devastating consequences. Survivors and their descendants carry the memory of that night, often sharing their stories to raise awareness about mental health and the importance of early intervention. Though more than 50 years have passed since January 30th, 1969, the murders left an indelible mark on Saskatchewan. The tragedy shaped local policies, influenced psychiatric practices, and left a community grappling with the long-term effects of violence that could have been prevented. For the Peterson family, the memory of that night is a reminder of both unimaginable loss and the resilience of those who survived to tell the story. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24th, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. He grew up on a pig farm just outside Vancouver, a place far from the city's busy streets. But life on the farm was far from peaceful. The Pickton family farm was described by neighbors as dirty and poorly kept, with animals wandering freely inside the house. Robert and his younger brother, David, had a difficult childhood. They were often bullied at school because of their messy appearance and the strong farm smell that followed them everywhere. Robert struggled in school and was placed in special education classes after failing second grade. He had a close, if complicated, relationship with his mother, but reportedly a troubled and distant connection with his father. One story that sticks out is from when Robert was about 12 years old. He raised a calf that he loved, but one day he came home to find it had been killed. This experience, combined with the neglectful environment, seemed to harden him and may have influenced how he viewed other living beings. After leaving school, Robert worked as a meat cutter apprentice for nearly 7 years. When his parents died in the late 1970s, he and his siblings inherited the family farm. Instead of leaving, Robert and his brother stayed and began hosting wild parties at the farm, which they called the Piggy Palace. These gatherings included various people from the local community, and the farm became known for its chaotic and lawless atmosphere. However, behind the scenes, Robert Pickton was hiding a dark and terrible secret that would later shock all of Canada. During the 1990s, the downtown east side of Vancouver became the center of growing concern. This neighborhood faced severe poverty, addiction, and homelessness. Many women living and working there were vulnerable, and they began to vanish without explanation. These women were often Indigenous and marginalized, making them especially at risk and frequently overlooked by society and law enforcement. Between the mid-1990s and early 2000s, numerous women disappeared from this area. Families reported them missing, but their cases did not receive the attention they deserved. Police often viewed these women through a lens of suspicion due to their involvement in drug use or work on the street, leading to delayed or minimal investigation. This lack of urgency allowed the disappearances to continue without immediate action. Meanwhile, Robert Pickton was exploiting this vulnerability. He used promises of money, drugs, and shelter to lure women to his farm in Port Coquitlam. What happened once they arrived was horrific. Over time, evidence would show that many women never left his property alive, turning the farm into a place of unimaginable tragedy. The growing number of missing women was a silent alarm that something terrible was happening, but the full story was still hidden from the public eye. Despite the growing number of missing women, police efforts to stop Robert Pickton were plagued by serious problems. One of the earliest missed chances came in March of 1997. A woman escaped from Pickton's farm, badly injured and terrified, and told police he had attacked her. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder and other offenses. But surprisingly, the charges were dropped in 1998 because prosecutors believed the victim's addiction issues made her unreliable. This decision had tragic consequences. After the charges were dropped, many more women went missing. Police had evidence from that earlier case, including Pickton's clothing, with DNA from missing women, but it was not properly tested for years. Additionally, tips from informants about Pickton's suspicious activities were ignored or mishandled. A major problem was poor communication between two police forces, the Vancouver Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The farm was in the RCMP's area, but the missing women reports came to the Vancouver police. This lack of coordination delayed the investigation. Later, a public inquiry called Forsaken exposed the systemic failures and biases that allowed Pickton to continue. It revealed that many officers and officials dismissed the missing women's cases because of their background and lifestyle. This failure to take the disappearances seriously created a dangerous environment that allowed a serial killer to operate freely for years. The breakthrough in the Robert Pickton case came in early 2002, but it was not related to the missing women investigation. A former employee reported seeing illegal firearms in Pickton's trailer, which gave the Royal Canadian Mounted Police enough reason to obtain a search warrant for the farm. On February 5th, 2002, a joint task force from the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP began searching the Port Coquitlam property. What they uncovered was horrifying. The farm was cluttered with old buildings, junk, and signs of long-term neglect. As they searched, police found personal belongings belonging to many missing women, including jewelry and clothing. Then human remains were discovered. This led to the largest forensic investigation in Canadian history, costing about $70 million. Specialists used heavy machinery and forensic technology to carefully examine the soil and buildings. In total, DNA from over 30 women was found on the property. Investigators also found severed body parts stored in containers and scattered remains across the farm. These discoveries confirmed the worst fears about Pickton's crimes and marked the beginning of his final legal battle. Robert Pickton was arrested on February 22nd, 2002, and initially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Over time, these charges grew to 26 counts. During his time in custody, an undercover officer posed as an inmate and recorded Pickton confessing that he had killed 49 women. He even said he regretted not reaching 50 victims, admitting his capture was due to carelessness. The trial began in January 2007, focusing on 6 of the murder charges to ensure a strong case. These 6 victims represented only a portion of the women whose remains were found on the farm. On December 9th, 2007, Pickton was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder, but was acquitted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, the harshest sentence allowed under Canadian law at the time. The remaining charges were stayed in 2010, a decision that left some families frustrated, feeling justice was incomplete. However, the case sparked important national conversations about the treatment of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the failures within law enforcement. Robert Pickton remained in prison until his death on May 31st, 2024, at the age of 74, after being assaulted by another inmate. His crimes and the failures that allowed them to continue serve as a powerful reminder of the need to protect society's most vulnerable members. The Pickton case changed Canada forever, shining a light on systemic issues that are still being addressed today. Gilbert Colin Thatcher was born in the year 1938 in Saskatchewan, a province where politics and farming shaped much of daily life. He was the son of Ross Thatcher, a man who would go on to serve as premier of the province from 1964 until his death in 1971. Growing up in this household, Colin Thatcher was surrounded by influence and privilege. He learned early on how much power and reputation mattered in public life, and he appeared destined to follow in his father's footsteps. Colin Thatcher was educated both in Canada and in the United States. He attended schools in Saskatchewan before studying at the University of Saskatchewan and later at the University of Wisconsin. These years gave him experience outside of his home province, but they also tied him closely to the image of a young man being groomed for leadership. In addition to politics, Thatcher developed a strong interest in ranching, and by the late 1960s, he managed large stretches of land near Moose Jaw. His success in agriculture boosted his standing, showing he was not only the son of a premier, but also a businessman in his own right. In the year 1962, Thatcher married Joanne Geiger. The two of them seemed to represent stability and prosperity, raising their 3 children in a world that blended wealth, politics, and rural traditions. For much of the 1960s, they lived the kind of life admired in Saskatchewan's close-knit communities. Publicly, Colin Thatcher worked to shape his image as a devoted family man and serious rancher. Privately, his drive for control and influence was already a central part of his personality. By the early 1970s, Colin Thatcher stepped formally into politics. In 1975, he was elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly for the Progressive Conservative Party. He quickly gained attention for being outspoken, ambitious, and confident, earning a reputation as a politician who was not afraid of confrontation. In 1982, when Grant Devine became premier, Thatcher was appointed as Minister of Energy and Mines. This placed him at the heart of one of the most important portfolios in Saskatchewan, where debates about resources and energy shaped much of the province's economy. During this time, Thatcher was seen by some as a rising star, and a man who had the name, the connections, and the experience to one day reach the top of Saskatchewan politics. But the pressure of public office, combined with the strain in his personal life, would soon set the stage for conflict. The same determination and defiance that served him in politics began to appear in his marriage and family relationships. Beneath the polished image of a powerful politician, tensions were building that would eventually spill out into one of the most infamous criminal cases in Canadian history. By the late 1970s, the marriage between Colin Thatcher and his wife Joanne had begun to unravel. What had once seemed like a picture of stability was breaking apart under constant arguments and growing mistrust. Thatcher's political career was advancing, but life at home was marked by distance and hostility. Joanne, who had once been supportive of her husband's ambitions, grew increasingly unhappy in the marriage. Their differences, once private, soon spilled into the open and became part of a bitter separation. In 1981, Joanne and Colin Thatcher formally divorced, ending nearly 2 decades of marriage. But the separation did not bring peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long and heated battle over money, property, and custody of their 3 children. Thatcher insisted on control, while Joanne pushed back, determined to secure independence for herself and her children. The legal fights between them became increasingly drawn out and filled with anger. The divorce coincided with Thatcher's growing influence in provincial politics, making the conflict a public matter as well as a private one. Joanne often felt intimidated and pressured, telling friends and family that she believed her former husband was determined to make her life as difficult as possible. The stress of their dispute began to affect Joanne's health and emotional well-being. Despite this, she refused to back down, continuing to pursue her rights in court. In the early 1980s, Joanne moved into a home in Regina, where she focused on raising her children and rebuilding her life. She tried to create stability in the face of constant legal and personal battles. Friends later recalled her as resilient, though deeply worn down by the ongoing struggles with her ex-husband. While Colin Thatcher projected the image of a successful rancher and politician, his feud with Joanne became an increasingly consuming part of his private life. As the years passed, the hostility between them only deepened. Disputes over financial support, property, and access to their children kept the two locked in conflict. Joanne often expressed fear and exhaustion, feeling as though she could never escape her ex-husband's reach. The bitterness of their divorce went beyond what many expected, raising concerns among those closest to Joanne that the situation could spiral further. This growing sense of unease would soon take a tragic turn, leaving Saskatchewan stunned. On the night of January 21st, 1983, Joanne Wilson was found dead in her Regina home. The scene left investigators immediately suspecting foul play. The violent nature of the crime stunned the community, not only because of its brutality, but also because Joanne was known as a kind and devoted mother who had been fighting to create stability after her divorce. Her death quickly became one of the most high-profile cases in Saskatchewan. Police launched an extensive investigation, combing through Joanne's personal life, her ongoing legal disputes, and her strained relationship with her ex-husband, Colin Thatcher. Almost immediately, questions arose about whether the hostility between the two had crossed into something darker. While Thatcher was a well-known political figure and had cultivated an image of authority and influence, the bitter divorce and lengthy custody battles placed him in the spotlight as a possible suspect. Detectives examined Joanne's home for evidence, collected witness statements, and followed leads that suggested her death may not have been a random act. Friends of Joanne told investigators that she had been fearful in the months leading up to her murder. Her concerns about safety became critical pieces in building a timeline of events that helped police narrow their focus. In the weeks following the crime, public interest only grew stronger. Newspapers across Saskatchewan carried daily updates, and radio stations discussed the shocking case, often connecting it back to Thatcher's political prominence. The murder was not just a personal tragedy, but now a public scandal that mixed politics, crime, and deep community concern. By mid-1983, investigators were convinced that Joanne's murder was a targeted attack rather than a random incident. They worked to gather enough evidence to support their suspicions, slowly building a case that pointed towards someone connected to Thatcher. Behind closed doors, whispers spread about the possibility of a murder-for-hire plot, something that would have seemed unimaginable only a few years earlier. The investigation set the stage for one of Saskatchewan's most sensational trials, where private family struggles would collide with public politics, and the question of Colin Thatcher's guilt would dominate headlines across the country. By May of 1984, after months of investigation, police formally charged Colin Thatcher with first-degree murder in connection with the death of his ex-wife, Joanne Wilson. His arrest shocked Saskatchewan, not only because of the crime itself, but because Thatcher had been a highly visible politician, once serving as Minister of Energy and Resources. The charges ensured that the case would become one of the most closely watched trials in Canadian history. The trial began in Saskatoon in the autumn of 1984. Courtrooms were filled daily with reporters, members of the public, and legal experts who wanted to witness the downfall of a man who had once belonged to one of the province's most prominent families. The prosecution presented a detailed case built on both circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, including accounts from individuals who claimed Thatcher had spoken openly about harming his ex-wife. Though the murder weapon was never recovered, prosecutors tied Thatcher to firearms purchases, suspicious activity near Joanne's home, and testimony that painted him as controlling and vengeful. Thatcher's defense team tried to dismantle the Crown's evidence, arguing that the case against him was built on speculation. In a dramatic move, Thatcher himself chose to testify. While he remained calm at times, moments of anger and arrogance on the stand weakened his credibility with the jury. The prosecution emphasized that Joanne's murder was not random, but instead the culmination of years of hostility, legal battles, and threats. On November the 6th, 1984, the jury delivered its verdict. Colin Thatcher was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The conviction marked a stunning fall from grace for a man born into political privilege, and it permanently linked his name to one of Canada's most infamous domestic homicide cases. Thatcher launched several appeals in the years that followed, all of which were rejected by higher courts. While serving his sentence, he wrote a book in which he claimed he had been wrongfully convicted. In response, Saskatchewan passed legislation to prevent convicted criminals from profiting off their crimes, directing royalties from his book toward victims' groups. After serving 22 years, Thatcher was granted full parole in November of 2006. He returned to private life, eventually remarrying and continuing to maintain his innocence. However, his legacy remained tarnished. In 2022, his attendance at a legislative ceremony caused public outrage, reigniting debate about whether he should ever have been welcomed back into the political arena. Today, the name Colin Thatcher is remembered less for his time as a cabinet minister and more for the crime that shocked a province. His conviction underscored how even those with power and influence are not immune to justice. For many Canadians, the case remains a chilling reminder of betrayal, abuse of privilege, and how a political dynasty collapsed under the weight of murder. Gilbert Paul Jordan, born Gilbert Paul Elsie on December 12, 1931, came into the world in Vancouver, British Columbia. His upbringing was not one of severe poverty or extreme violence, but it was shaped by rules and restrictions that he would later rebel against. His mother was a strict Christian who banned alcohol from the family home. This early prohibition may have only deepened his curiosity for drinking, because by his teenage years, alcohol had already taken a strong hold on his life. He left school in the 8th grade and never returned to formal education. By the time he was 16, he was a daily drinker, and alcohol was already guiding his choices. This was the beginning of a lifetime struggle that would not only destroy his own future, but also take the lives of others. Without education or stability, Jordan drifted into trouble with the law, beginning a criminal record in the early 1950s. His first known conviction came in 1952, marking the start of decades of arrests for crimes ranging from theft to assault. As a young man, Jordan was already known for erratic and often aggressive behavior, especially when drinking. He seemed unable or unwilling to control himself, and over the years, his reputation as a troublemaker grew. Police encounters became common, and each new arrest added to a pattern of disregard for rules and authority. Despite the growing list of charges, most of them resulted in minimal punishment, allowing him to quickly return to the streets. Jordan's dependence on alcohol was more than a personal habit. It became part of his identity. He was known to drink extreme amounts, boasting in later years about consuming more than 50 ounces of vodka a day. Even in his early adulthood, this level of drinking made him a figure people remembered, though not always for the right reasons. During this time, he picked up various labor jobs, but rarely kept steady work. His relationships were unstable, and he often surrounded himself with others who shared his heavy drinking lifestyle. Yet beneath this chaotic surface, there were early signs of something far more dangerous, an ability to charm or disarm people just long enough to take advantage of them. These years, in the 1950s and early 1960s, would lay the foundation for the disturbing pattern he would later follow. Jordan's addiction, combined with his willingness to break the law and his growing boldness, set the stage for a method of killing, unlike anything Canadian law enforcement had seen before. But at this point, his crimes had not yet escalated to murder, at least not officially. That would come later, and when it did, it would shock the country. By the mid-1960s, Gilbert Paul Jordan had moved beyond petty crimes and drunken disturbances. His encounters with the law became more frequent and more concerning. Police reports from this period described him as unpredictable, especially when heavily intoxicated. His drinking was no longer a habit. It was a compulsion that shaped every aspect of his life. Jordan began spending much of his time in Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood known for poverty, addiction, and a vulnerable population. Here, he found a constant supply of drinking companions, many of whom were struggling with alcohol dependency themselves. This environment provided him with both cover for his behavior and a pool of potential victims. In 1961, Jordan was convicted of indecent assault, marking his first recorded offense that hinted at a willingness to harm others directly. Over the next decade, he accumulated more charges, including theft, assault, and disorderly conduct. While many offenders might try to stay out of trouble after multiple arrests, Jordan seemed to thrive on risk. He learned how to manipulate situations, often using his ability to drink vast amounts of alcohol as a kind of performance to impress or disarm people. By the early 1970s, his alcohol tolerance had reached a staggering level. Witnesses claimed he could consume extraordinary amounts in a single sitting without losing complete control. Jordan began using this ability in a way that would later horrify investigators, encouraging others to drink with him, sometimes in dangerous quantities. His method was subtle at first. He would buy drinks for people he met in bars or on the street, often targeting those who were already intoxicated or in need of companionship. He presented himself as a generous drinking partner, but his true intentions were far darker. In these early years, there is evidence to suggest that deaths linked to extreme alcohol consumption may have occurred around him, though no official murder charges were filed at the time. Jordan's encounters with police during this period followed a pattern: short arrests, minimal sentences, and quick releases. Law enforcement often saw him as just another chronic drunk causing trouble, unaware that his behavior was developing into something far more deliberate. By the end of the 1970s, Jordan had refined a deadly approach that relied on alcohol, both as a weapon and as a shield. It was a method that would eventually make him one of Canada's most unusual serial killers, someone who didn't need a firearm or a knife to take a life, just a bottle and a plan. In the years ahead, this pattern would escalate, leaving a trail of suspicious deaths that few initially connected to the man behind them. In the early 1980s, Gilbert Paul Jordan's drinking habit had become his signature and his weapon. By this time, he was well known in certain parts of Vancouver's downtown east side, often spotted in bars, hotels, and inexpensive rooming houses. What few people realized was that his heavy drinking sessions with women were sometimes ending in tragedy. Jordan began frequenting establishments where vulnerable women, many of them living with addiction or financial hardship, could be found. He would offer drinks, companionship, and sometimes cash. His charm was limited, but his persistence and willingness to spend money often overcame initial hesitation. Once a woman agreed to join him, Jordan's drinking challenges would begin. He would urge them to match him drink for drink, sometimes adding strong liquor to their beverages without them noticing. From 1980 to 1987, several women died in circumstances that police initially attributed to accidental alcohol poisoning. The victims shared similarities. Most were found in hotel rooms or private residences shortly after spending time with Jordan, and all had extremely high blood alcohol levels. In some cases, the levels were so high they would have been lethal to most people. At first, these incidents were treated as isolated tragedies in a neighborhood already plagued by alcohol-related deaths. Autopsies showed no signs of physical violence, and with little evidence beyond the presence of alcohol, investigators often closed the cases without further inquiry. Jordan seemed to understand this gap in law enforcement attention and used it to his advantage. During this period, witnesses occasionally reported hearing Jordan urging women to keep drinking, sometimes offering incentives or making it a competitive game. In one instance, a bartender recalled him encouraging a visibly impaired woman to have another, even when she was struggling to remain conscious. Police records show that Jordan continued to face minor charges for public drunkenness and disorderly behavior throughout these years, but none connected him directly to the deaths. The absence of overt violence allowed him to operate without serious scrutiny, even as the number of unexplained alcohol-related fatalities around him grew. By the mid-1980s, whispers about Jordan's possible involvement in these deaths began circulating among some in the community. Still, without clear evidence, law enforcement had no grounds for a serious criminal case. It would take one final, highly suspicious death to bring him into the full focus of investigators and expose the deadly pattern he had perfected over years. By late 1987, police in Vancouver began noticing troubling similarities in a series of alcohol-related deaths involving women. Reports from coroners revealed that several victims had blood alcohol levels far beyond what would normally be survivable. In more than one case, the last person seen with these women was Gilbert Paul Jordan. The turning point came in November of that year. Jordan had checked into a local hotel with a woman, and within hours, she was found dead. Her blood alcohol level was recorded at more than 4 times the legal limit for driving, a concentration considered life-threatening. Staff members recalled seeing Jordan leave the room alone, calm and unhurried. This time, however, police decided not to treat the case as just another unfortunate accident. Investigators quietly began tracking Jordan's movements. Over the course of several days, undercover officers observed him visiting bars, approaching women, and enticing them to drink heavily. They documented conversations in which he repeatedly urged the women to consume more alcohol, sometimes offering cash or making lighthearted bets to encourage them. During this surveillance period, officers intervened more than once to prevent potential tragedies. In one incident, they entered a hotel room to find a woman unconscious, with Jordan beside her. She was rushed to the hospital, where medical staff determined her blood alcohol level was dangerously high, but not yet fatal. This confirmed the suspicion that his behavior was not coincidental, but deliberate. Police soon gathered enough evidence to connect Jordan to multiple suspicious deaths dating back several years. The challenge was that the manner of killing, forcing or persuading victims to consume lethal amounts of alcohol, was legally complex to prosecute, especially since there were rarely physical signs of assault. Still, investigators pressed forward, compiling a case that would focus on the most recent incidents, where evidence and witness testimony were strongest. By the end of November 1987, Jordan was arrested and formally charged in connection with the death of one woman and the attempted killings of several others. His arrest made headlines across Canada, shocking the public with the unusual and unsettling nature of his alleged crimes. While the details would emerge more fully in court, it was already clear that the authorities had finally cornered a man who had managed to operate in plain sight for years without serious consequence. The trial of Gilbert Paul Jordan began in early 1988. Prosecutors focused on his pattern of behavior, presenting evidence from the hotel surveillance, witness statements, and coroner reports. They emphasized how Jordan had repeatedly supplied alcohol to vulnerable women, resulting in fatal overdoses, and how police had intervened to prevent additional deaths. The courtroom heard how his actions over more than 2 decades created a deadly pattern that distinguished him from accidental cases of alcohol poisoning. Jordan pleaded not guilty, maintaining that the deaths were unintentional and that he had no criminal intent. The defense argued that the women were responsible for their own alcohol consumption. However, the prosecution successfully used similar fact evidence, showing a consistent pattern of behavior across multiple incidents. This approach allowed the jury to see a clear link between Jordan's actions and the deaths, demonstrating that the fatalities were not isolated accidents. After several weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict in late 1988. Gilbert Paul Jordan was found guilty of manslaughter in the death of Vanessa Lee Buckner, as well as charges related to the attempted deaths of other women. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, though his sentence was later reduced on appeal. He served 6 years before being released on parole in 1994. Despite the relatively short prison term, Jordan's case remained a stark example of the legal challenges in prosecuting deaths caused indirectly by a perpetrator. The impact of the case extended beyond the courtroom. It raised awareness of how marginalized communities, particularly Indigenous women struggling with addiction, could be systematically overlooked by authorities. Public debate focused on the responsibility of society to protect vulnerable populations and the need for better investigative procedures. Jordan's ability to evade serious charges for so long highlighted significant gaps in policing, law enforcement coordination, and social services. Gilbert Paul Jordan died in 2006 from health complications related to his long-term alcoholism. While he was never convicted of murder, his legacy remains one of infamy in Canadian criminal history. The case continues to be studied by criminologists, law enforcement, and advocates for vulnerable communities as a warning of how easily predators can exploit societal neglect. Ultimately, the story of Gilbert Paul Jordan is not just about a single man, but about systemic failures, overlooked victims, and the importance of vigilance in protecting those most at risk. His crimes serve as a reminder of the dark consequences when society fails to act, leaving vulnerable people exposed to harm for far too long.